Hey Guy, tonight we will explore a story that sounds like fiction, yet every word of it is true. The story of the woman once called the Hairy Lady, Barbara van Beck. Barbara Ursula was born with a rare medical condition now known as hypertrichosis, or werewolf syndrome. Her entire body was covered in thick hair, a terrifying anomaly in the eyes of the 17th century world. Yet what made her name endure through history was not her condition, but how she faced it. With intelligence, composure, and the guidance of her husband, Johann Michael van Beck, Barbara managed to transform what others saw as a curse into an extraordinary source of independence. She turned her unusual appearance into a form of art, performance, and livelihood. A travelling exhibition that drew crowds across Europe, from London to Paris, Rome, and Milan. The very curiosity that might have destroyed her became the foundation of her survival. She met nobles, scholars, and artists. She earned fame and fortune, and she lived a life completely unlike the one fate seemed to assign her. Yet one question still lingers. Was Barbara truly free, or merely living a life designed by others, one shaped by fascination, control, and silent humiliation? So before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy these stories and wish to hear more of them. Now, tell me in the comments below where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Then, dim the lights, let the world grow quiet. Perhaps let the hum of a fan fill the background. And together, let us drift gently into tonight's story. Barbara Ursula, later known to history as Barbara van Beck, was born on the 18th of February, 1629, in or near the old city of Augsburg, Germany. Her parents, Balthasar and Anne Ursula, were ordinary people, neither noble nor wealthy, belonging to the quiet fabric of a modest community. In any other circumstance, their daughter might have lived and died unrecorded, another forgotten soul of the 17th century. Yet fate, in its strange way, chose differently for her. It gave Barbara a body that would one day both astonish and unsettle all of Europe. From her earliest years, those who looked upon her noticed something unusual. A fine layer of soft hair covering her skin on her arms, her cheeks, even across her forehead. As she grew, the hair thickened until her face and body were cloaked in it entirely. What modern science calls hypertrichosis, also known as Ambras syndrome, or more poetically, werewolf syndrome, was the rare condition that shaped her life. It may appear at birth, passed silently through a faulty gene, or it may arise later through unknown causes. Across all of recorded history, fewer than 100 true cases have been documented. That number, even when written plainly, feels unreal. It whispers of isolation, of lives lived beneath a veil of curiosity and fear. But numbers never tell the whole story. For every one of those 100 names that history preserved, there were surely others children who did not survive infancy. Women hidden away by families ashamed or terrified. Men who wandered too far from compassion to find a place in society. Barbara might have been one of them, had her parents chosen secrecy. Instead, they saw in her both a burden and a strange kind of opportunity. In the world of the 1600s, medicine had not yet learned how to explain such differences. Illness and deformity were tangled with superstition, and anything that challenged the ordinary could be mistaken for a sign of sin or witchcraft. People whispered that those covered in hair had been cursed, that their appearance marked them as beasts in human form. And yet, there was also wonder. The same fearful crowds who crossed themselves in horror were often the first to pay money to see what they called nature's marvels. So little Barbara grew beneath the weight of two opposing gazes, disgust and fascination. She was at once pitied and exploited, scorned and admired. It is easy to imagine her, a small child standing before a mirror, trying to smooth the hair on her face, trying to understand why her reflection was not like the others. The candlelight would catch the fine brown strands, and in that quiet flicker she might have sensed both the strangeness and the fragile beauty of her existence. Hypertrichosis, as physicians later discovered, could be inherited or acquired, its cause buried deep within the human code. But in the early 17th century, such knowledge was far beyond reach. To her family, it was simply an undeniable truth, a daughter born unlike any other. And in that truth lay the beginning of an extraordinary destiny. Perhaps what saved Barbara was not the condition itself, but the world's hunger for spectacle. In an age before newspapers carried photographs, before theatre and science were separate worlds, a single remarkable body could travel farther than any scholar's words. People wanted to see her, to look, to marvel, to whisper. Some came out of pity, others out of cruel amusement, but all came nonetheless. And Barbara, still a child, stood beneath their stares and learned the first lesson of survival, that her difference, painful as it was, could also be her power. Through the decades that followed, she would cross countries and languages, appear in diaries, letters, and portraits, proof that she lived, that she spoke, that she played the harpsichord and wore the fashions of her time. But all of that began here, in the small cradle of Augsburg, with two ordinary parents and one extraordinary child. If we close our eyes now, we might picture that moment long ago. The narrow streets, the winter air, the cry of a newborn whose face shimmered with fine brown hair. Outside, snow drifted past wooden shutters. Inside, a mother whispered a prayer, not knowing that her daughter, the hairy girl, would one day be known across all of Europe. And as night settles over that distant century, Barbara's story begins not with grandeur or tragedy, but with the quiet heartbeat of a child who would carry both wonder and loneliness through the years to come. Hypertrichosis exists in two principal forms: congenital and acquired. The congenital type arises from a genetic fault, a tiny imperfection woven into the thread of inheritance that causes hair to grow thick and long across the body from the moment of birth. The acquired form appears later, its cause less certain, perhaps an interaction of medicine, diet, or circumstance, though even today, science has not fully untangled its mystery. In the case of Barbara Ursula, some historians believe her condition was congenital. Yet there survives a curious record suggesting otherwise. It was said that Barbara herself once claimed that her body hair began to thicken only when she was about 7 years old. That single detail, passed down through time, has puzzled those who study her life. If true, it might point toward the acquired form of hypertrichosis. But what could have caused it? In Barbara's century, the 17th, there were no chemical treatments, no drugs, no industrial toxins that might explain such a transformation. The historian must then stand still, as though before a locked door whose key has long been lost. Some have wondered whether Barbara was mistaken, or whether those who recorded her words had confused them. Others suggest that the English diarist Samuel Pepys, who possibly met her decades later, may have misheard her story altogether. Pepys, ever the curious observer of London's strange spectacles, wrote that he encountered a woman with a beard who claimed her hair began to grow at the age of 7. The description, though imperfect, aligns eerily with Barbara's condition and the timeline of her travels. Yet it remains uncertain whether Pepys truly met Barbara van Beck, or another woman like her. For all we know, Barbara's case may well have been congenital, after all only becoming thicker, more visible, and more arresting around her 7th year. Whatever the truth, no environmental factor could explain such a lifelong transformation. Hypertrichosis, once it appears, remains unrelenting. There is no cure, not in Barbara's time, nor truly in ours. Today, laser treatments and electrolysis can lessen the symptoms, though they work only on dark hairs and require many sessions. In the 17th century, such options were dreams beyond imagination. A woman like Barbara could do little but shave, again and again, if she wished to hide her difference. Yet the act of shaving away what made her unique might also mean shaving away the one thing that gave her family a means of survival. In those early years, the Ursula household must have faced a difficult truth. They lived in a world that viewed difference not with compassion, but with curiosity mixed with cruelty. A girl covered in hair would not easily find friendship, schooling, or marriage. But as word spread, the same strangeness that could isolate her might also attract attention and money. In an age where the unusual became entertainment, Barbara's body became a living exhibition. To her parents, it was not simply a child they saw, but a livelihood. Removing the hair would erase the spectacle, the source of fascination that drew the curious and the wealthy alike. Perhaps they felt guilt. Perhaps they justified it as necessity. History does not tell us their thoughts. It tells us only that Barbara's fate became bound to the world's hunger to look to see the extraordinary, to measure themselves against the inexplicable. From that moment, Barbara's life was no longer entirely her own. She was to become, in a sense, both performer and prisoner, displayed not for what she could do, but for what she could not change. Yet it is important to remember she was still a child. Around her, the world of Augsburg carried on as usual, the church bells ringing, merchants selling their wares, the cold winter smoke drifting from the chimneys. And somewhere within those quiet streets, a little girl looked into a mirror and saw reflected not her own face, but a destiny shaped by other people's eyes. The delicate line between fascination and exploitation would follow Barbara throughout her life. Each strand of hair became a thread, binding her to the gaze of strangers. In another time, perhaps she might have lived differently, loved differently, walked the streets without whispers trailing behind her. But 17th century Europe was not kind to difference. It loved to stare, to label, to turn human lives into curiosities. Thus, as she grew, Barbara learned the strange economy of her existence. The more she was seen, the more she was valued. The less she hid, the more she could survive. Her family, whether reluctantly or deliberately, recognized this truth. They did not try to cure her. They did not send her away. Instead, they prepared her for the world's stage, a stage that would stretch across London, Copenhagen, Paris, Rome, and beyond. Before that journey began, however, came the quiet understanding of what she had become. Not merely a girl with a medical condition, but a phenomenon in the making. And as the candlelight flickered across the walls of their modest home, her parents must have realized that Barbara's body, as strange and wondrous as it seemed, had become their family's one fragile key to survival. In a time when difference was both feared and desired, Barbara van Beck, still only a child, was destined to live in the narrow space between those two emotions, forever caught in the world's uneasy fascination. At the age of 8, Barbara Ursula's life took a path that no child could ever choose for herself. Her parents, Balthazar and Anne, began taking her from town to town, showing her to paying audiences who came from near and far to see the girl with the face of a wolf. What had once been a quiet household in Augsburg now turned into a travelling enterprise. The Ursula family discovered that curiosity was a powerful currency, and Barbara, their small daughter covered in soft brown hair, was now the source of it. In an age long before photography or cinema, people flocked to witness what they could not imagine. And so Barbara became a living exhibition, a spectacle that walked and breathed. The year 1637 marked her first recorded appearance in London, where an English diarist named John Evelyn would later remember seeing her as a child. 2 years later, in 1639, she was in Copenhagen, the northern winds brushing against her face as she sat quietly before a crowd. By 1645, she had reached Paris, a city of endless fascination for the unusual. Then came Rome in 1647, and Milan in 1648, each city. Another stop, another hall, another audience who gasped and whispered as she was presented before them. Years passed, and the little girl who once stood trembling before strangers grew into a young woman accustomed to their gaze. She returned to her native Augsburg in 1653, perhaps to rest, perhaps to begin again under her own will. 2 years later, she was seen in Frankfurt in 1655, then in London once more in 1657, where Evelyn saw her again no longer a child, but a woman who had lived under the eyes of Europe. After that came Beauvais in 1660, and finally England again in 1668. Each date, each city, traces a map not just of movement, but of endurance. Barbara travelled through decades of changing kingdoms, wars, and plagues, yet her name endured, whispered in marketplaces and courts alike. She had become a phenomenon, a curiosity whose fame crossed borders. Yet fame, as always, comes at a cost. For many years, Barbara had no say in her own fate. Her parents made the arrangements, handled the money, and decided when and where she would be shown. She stood beneath oil lamps, candlelight, and torches, allowing strangers to stare, to murmur, to point. The coins fell not into her hands, but into theirs. Imagine her then, a girl with tired eyes, listening to the sound of carriages outside some rented inn, hearing the laughter of spectators fade into night. The silence after applause must have been heavy. Perhaps she wondered if she was loved at all, or merely profitable. Yet she kept travelling, because travelling was the only life she knew. But history is kind enough to tell us that her story did not end there. In 1657, Barbara's life took an unexpected turn. She married a Dutchman named Johann Michael van Beck. The world would later remember her by his name Barbara van Beck. Whether their union was born of affection or arrangement, we cannot be sure. Some later writers would cruelly claim that Van Beck married her only to display her for money, but such words are shadows, not facts. What is known is that she gained, for the first time, a sense of partnership. With Johann, Barbara began to manage her own career. She was no longer a child passed from city to city, but a woman who understood the strange kind of power she held over the public imagination. Together they continued to travel, though now as equals or as close to equals as that century would allow. In time, she gave birth to a son, it is said, who did not share her condition. He was born without the excessive hair that had defined his mother's life. A quiet miracle that may have brought Barbara the comfort of knowing the affliction would not follow her family line. As the years folded one into another, Barbara's transformation became clear. Once, she had been the hairy child of Augsburg, led by her parents' hands from one stage to the next. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a performer by her own design. The world that once used her had become, in a way, her own stage, a place she knew how to navigate, how to survive within. Still, when the crowds gathered and the curtains lifted, it was the same face they came to see. The woman whose skin was covered in soft brown hair, whose eyes were intelligent and calm, whose presence silenced even the most skeptical. To some, she remained a marvel of nature, to others, a wonder of endurance. And though she lived within the boundaries of other people's fascination, Barbara van Beck had found something rare, a voice, however quiet, within the noise. Her journey across Europe had turned her difference into livelihood, her pain into purpose. And in that transformation lay the beginning of her own form of freedom, a fragile, flickering light carried through the endless halls of curiosity, where a little girl had once stood, and a woman now stood taller. More than a century after Barbara's death, in the year 1769, the English author James Granger wrote about her with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. In his account, he claimed that Barbara's husband, Johann Michael van Beck, had married her solely to exploit her condition, to carry her about for a show. His words painted the picture of a man devoid of love, using his wife's appearance as a form of profit. Yet, like so many judgments from a distance, his statement had no source, no evidence, only the echo of prejudice. It reflected less about Barbara's marriage and more about how her story was viewed through the moral lens of later centuries, where compassion was often blurred by mockery. Another writer, Henry Wilson, contributed to the confusion more than 100 years later. He asserted that Barbara had married in 1654 at the age of 26, and even went so far as to change her name, calling her Augustina Barbara. Elsewhere in his own writing, however, he reverted to the name Barbara Ursuline, suggesting that even he was uncertain about his own account. Wilson's inconsistencies, like Granger's contempt, only deepened the fog around Barbara's life. And so, scholars and readers turned back toward the primary sources, searching for the truth that existed not in rumour, but in the quiet ink of contemporary witnesses. Among those sources stands one of the most reliable voices of the 17th century, the English diarist John Evelyn. His journals are filled with careful observations, written not with cruelty, but with the curiosity of a man who watched history unfold in the ordinary details of his time. Evelyn saw Barbara not once, but twice, during her years of travel. In his entry dated the 15th of September, 1657, he described his encounter with extraordinary precision. "I also saw the hairy maid," Evelyn wrote, "or woman whom 20 years before I had also seen when a child." His words bridged 2 decades of Barbara's life, from the frightened girl he once glimpsed to the composed woman she had become. He continued, "Her very eyebrows were combed upward, and all her forehead as thick and even as grows on any woman's head, neatly dressed. From each ear," he observed, "came 2 locks very long, and her face bore a most prolix beard and mustachios, with hair sprouting even on the very middle of her nose. The rest of her body," he noted, "was not so hairy, yet exceedingly long in comparison. Arms, neck, breast, and back, the colour of a bright brown, and fine as well-dressed flax. And it is a strange and haunting image, an attempt to describe what no one could quite comprehend. Evelyn saw her as both human and extraordinary, a living paradox of beauty and strangeness. Yet unlike others, he did not call her monstrous. His tone, though clinical, carries a measure of respect, even fascination. Evelyn went on to write that Barbara was now married and had one child. That was not Harry, nor were any of her parents or relations. She was born, he confirmed, at Augsburg in Germany. And for the rest, he added gently, very well shaped, played well on the harpsichord. Those few lines reveal a woman of education and refinement, not a spectacle of pity. To play the harpsichord in the 17th century required training, patience, and discipline, qualities that speak of intelligence and grace. In a Europe where few women of humble birth could read or write, Barbara's skill in both language and music sets her apart. She was not merely the object of curiosity painted by the public, but a cultivated individual who had learned to move elegantly within the narrow space that society allowed her. From Evelyn's account, one can almost see her seated before the instrument, her hands perhaps covered in fine brown hair moving gracefully over the keys as sound filled the room. The onlookers who had come expecting a beast would have been met instead with melody, order, and poise. In that moment, Barbara reclaimed something precious: dignity. Her portraits from this period confirm Evelyn's description. She is shown wearing fashionable 17th century clothing, her neckline modestly low, as was the style of the time. The softness of her gaze contrasts with the wildness of her condition. These portraits were not caricatures. They were affirmations of her presence, proof that she belonged to her era as much as any lady of court or scholar's wife. Through Evelyn's careful eyes, history grants Barbara van Beck a rare gift: humanity. Beneath the layers of myth and moral judgment, we see not a creature, but a woman who spoke, played, and carried herself with grace. She was, as Evelyn's words suggest, very well shaped, her manner courteous, her voice likely calm. And so, from the ink of one man's diary, we glimpse the truth that so many others overlooked, that Barbara van Beck was more than what her reflection revealed. She was a woman who, despite her strangeness, had learned to live with refinement in a world that could not decide whether to fear or to admire her. In the gentle tone of Evelyn's writing, her image remains poised between mystery and respect, an echo of a life that refused to be defined by appearance alone. Portraits of Barbara van Beck from this later period show a woman who had come to inhabit her difference with quiet command. She wore the fashionable gowns of her century low-necked, as was the custom in Europe during the mid-17th century, not, as later gossip suggested, to expose the hair that covered her chest and shoulders, but simply because that was how women of taste dressed. The fabric folds, the pearls, and the posture all spoke the language of refinement. She no longer appeared as a curiosity forced upon the world, but as a figure who had learned to exist within it, using its fascination as a means of survival. Though the eyes of others never stopped following her, Barbara found a way to make that gaze her livelihood. She performed, conversed, and even entertained with music, often playing the harpsichord that John Evelyn had mentioned in his diary. She spoke to nobles and scholars alike, her voice described as soft and feminine, a gentle contrast to the striking image of her bearded face. Across more than 3 decades of travel from Augsburg to London, from Paris to Milan, Barbara became a familiar presence in fairs, salons, and exhibitions throughout Europe. Where once she had been led by her parents' hands, now she appeared as a woman who understood how to balance dignity and display, how to turn the world's curiosity into her own form of independence. By the year 1668, Barbara was once again in London, the city that had welcomed and watched her since childhood. A note written by John Bulfinch, carefully inscribed beneath one of her printed portraits, records that he saw her that very year, on Ratcliffe Highway, a road that wound between the heart of the city and its busy docklands. Bulfinch wrote that he was satisfied she was a woman. A simple yet telling remark that reveals both the skepticism she still faced and the quiet patience with which she endured it. In an age when people questioned even her sex, Barbara continued to meet the public with composure. That same year, the ever-curious diarist Samuel Pepys also recorded a visit that may well have been to Barbara herself. On the 21st of December, 1668, he noted that he went into Holborn and there saw the woman that is to be seen with a beard. In his entry, he described her as A little plain woman, a Dane. Her name, Ursula Dian, about 40 years old. Her voice like a little girl's, with a beard as much as any man I ever saw, black almost, and grisly. Pepys added that the hair had begun to grow at about 7 years old, and was shaved not above 7 months ago, and is now so big as any man's almost that ever I saw. The details are both vivid and imprecise. Pepys's Ursula Dian was said to be Danish, not German. The name and nationality are wrong. Yet the rest the age of about 40, the time, the place, and above all the rare condition align too perfectly to be coincidence. Historians now believe that Pepys likely did see Barbara van Beck and simply recorded her name and origin incorrectly, as travellers' tales often grew distorted when passed through accent and rumour. When we read Pepys's words slowly, we can almost sense his mixture of wonder and unease. He was fascinated, perhaps amused, yet unsure how to place what he saw. To him, she was both proof of nature's strangeness and a reminder of how fragile the line between male and female, beauty and oddity, could be. For Barbara, it must have been yet another evening of enduring the stare of men who looked but did not truly see. In the dim lantern light of Holborn, she stood before her audience, her beard dark and thick, her hands steady. She spoke softly, answered their questions, perhaps smiled politely when they asked the same ones she had heard 100 times before. Somewhere behind her, a curtain, a husband, a manager, a world that would not let her simply be. The fragment left by Bulfinch and the record written by Pepys are the last confirmed traces of Barbara van Beck's life. They show her still travelling, still performing, still meeting the curiosity of others with poise. Yet they also leave a lingering question that history cannot answer. Was Barbara by then truly free a woman directing her own path, turning the spectacle into sustenance, or was she still bound by the same invisible chains of fascination that had encircled her since childhood? Perhaps the truth lay somewhere in between. She had learned to survive within the world that once pitied and mocked her, but even survival requires performance. Beneath the lights and whispers, behind the polite conversation and the harpsichord melodies, there may have remained a quiet ache, the wish to live unseen, if only for a single day. And so, the year 1668 becomes both an ending and a beginning. The last time Barbara was seen, and the moment when she began to fade into the soft grey mist of history, carrying with her the unspoken question that still echoes through the centuries: was she the master of her own story, or merely the marvel that others demanded her to be? On the 21st of December, 1668, the London diarist Samuel Pepys recorded in his journal a brief but vivid encounter that would later become one of the final glimpses of Barbara van Beck. His words, written in the steady ink of routine observation, carried the tone of a man both intrigued and unsettled by what he saw. "I went into Holborn," he wrote, "and there saw the woman that is to be seen with a beard. He continued with characteristic precision. "She is a little plain woman, a Dane. Her name, Ursula Dian, about 40 years old, her voice like a little girl's, with a beard as much as any man I ever saw, black almost, and grisly." Pepys noted that it began to grow at about 7 years old, and was shaved not above 7 months ago, and is now so big as any man's almost that ever I saw. To him it was a curious spectacle, a momentary diversion in a day otherwise filled with meetings, meals, and errands. He concluded that "it was a strange sight to me, I confess, and what pleased me mightily." The entry lasted only a few lines, yet within those lines lies the shadow of Barbara van Beck's final chapter. Though Pepys described the woman as Danish and gave her the name Ursula Dian, both details were mistaken. Barbara had been born Barbara Ursula, a name close enough in sound that one might easily imagine it softened or altered in conversation, especially across languages and accents. Moreover, she was not Danish but German, born in or near Augsburg on the 18th of February, 1629. Yet the coincidences between Pepys's Ursula Dian and Barbara van Beck are too precise to ignore. Both women were described as being about 40 years old, both bore a heavy dark beard, and both were seen in London in the same year, 1668. The same year noted by John Bulfinch in his comment beneath Barbara's portrait on Ratcliffe Highway. The odds that two such women, both afflicted by the extraordinarily rare condition of hypertrichosis, would appear in the same city, in the same year, at the same age, are so remote that most historians now agree they must have been one and the same. Hypertrichosis itself is so rare that fewer than 100 cases have been recorded across all of human history. The likelihood of another woman foreign, middle-aged, and travelling through England with the same affliction seems almost impossible. What remains far more plausible is that Pepys, who often jotted down his observations quickly, heard Ursula as Ursula, and mistook her nationality, as was common when foreigners spoke English in that era. Even with these errors, Pepys's description adds texture to Barbara's later life. He wrote that her voice was like a little girl's, soft and high-pitched, suggesting the gentleness Evelyn had described a decade earlier. He also remarked that her beard had been shaved not above 7 months ago, which aligns with the known fact that those who managed her public appearances occasionally trimmed her hair to emphasize regrowth and spectacle proof that her exhibitions were still active in the late 1660s. Pepys's tone, though fascinated, was not cruel. To him, she was a curiosity, a momentary wonder that stirred amazement rather than fear. Yet behind his casual words lies a deeper truth that Barbara van Beck's reputation had endured so powerfully that even one of England's most meticulous chroniclers took time to witness her. By then, she had been touring for more than 3 decades, moving through the great cities of Europe: London, Copenhagen, Paris, Rome, Milan, Frankfurt, Augsburg, and back again. Her image had appeared in prints and portraits, her name murmured in the diaries of scholars and travellers. Even after so many years, her presence in London drew crowds eager to confirm the legend that the hairy woman who had once amazed Europe was still alive, still playing the role that fate had assigned her. If Pepys truly met Barbara that winter night, she would have been nearly 40 years old, her face framed in dark curls, her hands perhaps resting calmly before her as she endured yet another round of inspection. She might have answered softly, her voice polite, her gaze distant. For him it was an oddity to record. For her, it was the rhythm of survival, a ritual performed thousands of times before. In this brief meeting between 2 lives, one a famous diarist, the other a woman turned into legend, history captured its final flicker of Barbara van Beck's existence. There would be no further entries, no later sightings. The ink of Pepys's diary marked the last trace of a life lived beneath the gaze of others. And so, as the page of his journal closes, Barbara begins to fade from view. The crowds disperse, the lights dim, and the city outside Holborn falls quiet under the winter fog. Her story, once told in whispers and wonder, lingers now only in the faint scratch of a pen, a small testament that, for one brief evening in 1668, London again turned its curious eyes toward the woman the world had called both monstrous and marvellous. Though the writings of John Evelyn, John Bulfinch, and Samuel Pepys are invaluable for reconstructing the life of Barbara van Beck, they also reveal the harsh and humiliating world. She inhabited a world where human beings could be treated as curiosities, displayed for entertainment, and measured not by their character, but by their strangeness. Beneath the fascination of 17th century Europe lay something darker, a culture that transformed wonder into spectacle and dignity into profit. Evelyn's diary, though careful and factual, is startling in its intimacy. His description of Barbara includes details so personal they make the reader uneasy, even now, centuries later. He noted that hair covered not only her face but her chest, her back, her neck and her arms. His words, written in calm observation, nonetheless strip away her privacy, turning her body into a field of study. In his defense, Evelyn was a man of science and curiosity, a product of an era when anatomy and spectacle often intertwined. But the act of describing a woman's chest and back in such clinical detail also reflects a society that saw her not as a person, but as an exhibit, something to be looked at, examined, discussed. John Bulfinch, who saw Barbara more than a decade later in 1668, wrote beneath her portrait that he had been satisfied she was a woman. That single phrase exposes the cruelty of the time. To be satisfied of a woman's gender implies proof that could only be demanded through intrusion. The remark suggests that Barbara, or those who managed her appearances, may have been pressured to show parts of her body to confirm that she was indeed female. And then there is Samuel Pepys, whose diary, usually filled with accounts of politics and pleasure, also captures this unsettling reality. He wrote that those showing the bearded woman offered to give his wife further satisfaction if she desired it, but refused such demonstrations to men. His words, almost casual, reveal a practice deeply degrading by any standard. To offer further satisfaction meant allowing someone to inspect Barbara's private body to confirm her sex proof that she was not a man disguised as a woman. It is a small detail, yet it opens a chasm of pain. We cannot know whether Barbara consented to these humiliations or endured them under pressure. Perhaps her husband or manager insisted. Perhaps the audience demanded it. Or perhaps she had learned that compliance meant survival. But each instance tells us how little control she truly possessed. Beneath the glamour of her fame, she remained vulnerable to the same exploitative gaze that had followed her since childhood. To the crowds who came to see her, Barbara was a natural wonder, a marvel of God's design, a living mystery to be solved. Yet to Barbara herself, each exhibition may have felt like another theft of her body, her privacy, her womanhood. Her beard and the hair upon her skin drew fascination, but that fascination came with a price. Behind every glance, every whispered comment, every coin dropped at the door, there was an unspoken truth. People paid not to understand her, but to confirm their own sense of normalcy. In this, Barbara's story becomes not only personal, but universal. Her life reflects the experience of many women of the 17th century, those who lived beneath the authority of fathers, husbands, and patrons, and whose worth was often tied to appearance, obedience, or novelty. To be female was already to be observed. To be different was to be displayed. We must imagine her standing in a dimly lit room, the air thick with candle smoke, as strangers whispered and speculated about her. Some stared in awe, others in pity, and a few in cruel amusement. Somewhere behind them, the clink of coins marked the end of another performance. Then the doors would close, and the silence would return. In that silence, perhaps Barbara would sit by herself, removing the pins from her hair, her reflection flickering in the glass. How heavy those evenings must have felt. How far she must have travelled within herself just to endure them. Even as her fame spread across Europe, Barbara van Beck remained trapped in the contradictions of her era. Admired, yet objectified. Respected, yet violated. Independent, yet controlled. Her condition made her remarkable, but it also denied her the very right to privacy that others took for granted. When historians read the words of Evelyn, Bulfinch, and Pepys today, they find not just the outline of a woman's life, but a mirror reflecting the age that surrounded her, a time when curiosity was often cruel and entertainment came at the cost of someone else's dignity. And so, as we look back on these journals and sketches, we hear an echo of the quiet suffering that lies between their lines. It is the sound of a woman enduring the unbearable weight of being watched. For all her fame, Barbara van Beck lived within the confines of the human gaze, a gaze that could admire her beauty and intelligence, yet still deny her the most basic of freedoms, the right to be seen as whole. The note written by John Bulfinch in the year 1668 stands as the final confirmed record of Barbara van Beck's existence. After that, the trail of her life falls silent. No more letters mention her. No diary entries describe her. No exhibitions or portraits appear. She simply fades from history, like candlelight at the edge of dawn. At that time, Barbara would have been approaching 50 years old, an age that, in the 17th century, was considered long-lived, especially for a woman who had spent her entire life travelling, performing, and enduring the strain of public display. The average life expectancy in Europe hovered around 35 to 40 years, yet Barbara had outlived that measure. Her disappearance after 1668 might therefore mark either a quiet death or a deliberate withdrawal from the gaze that had defined her since childhood. No record tells us where she went. Some historians have speculated that she may have died in England, perhaps only months after Pepys and Bulfinch saw her. Others believe she might have returned to Germany, to her birthplace of Augsburg, or perhaps to Holland, her husband Johann Michael van Beck's homeland. There is even the faint possibility that she lived a few more years, tucked away in obscurity, her exhibitions behind her, her name no longer printed on handbills or whispered in curiosity. But beyond that final year, there is only silence. In that silence, however, her image endured. Her likeness continued to appear in engravings and paintings, her name occasionally reprinted in old catalogues of wonders and natural curiosities. To the generations that followed, she remained a figure half real, half legend, a woman both admired and pitied, whose face was covered in fine brown hair, and whose story seemed to belong to the twilight space between science and superstition. Yet if one reads the surviving words of those who saw her, the journals of John Evelyn, the brief note of John Bulfinch, the entry of Samuel Pepys, a clearer picture emerges. They speak of a woman who was articulate, graceful, and intelligent, not a grotesque creature, but a performer who had learned to move within her own fate. Through those scattered voices, we glimpse not a monster, but a person who bore her difference with an unspoken dignity. It is tempting to imagine her final years in a quiet town somewhere, far from the crowded halls of exhibition. Perhaps she lived in a modest house, its windows open to the wind, her harpsichord resting in a corner, the keys still touched from time to time by hands that had once performed for princes and scholars. Perhaps she walked the narrow streets unseen, a shawl drawn over her face, her reflection known only to herself. There are no records to confirm it, but sometimes the absence of noise is its own kind of peace. For a woman whose entire life had been defined by being looked at, the choice or the fate to vanish may have been the gentlest ending possible. To disappear from the world's gaze was, in a way, to reclaim her own image, to exist beyond the judgment of others. Whether she died soon after or lived for years more, Barbara van Beck stepped at last into anonymity, leaving behind the name that Europe had whispered for decades. What remains are fragments, portraits painted in London, sketches printed in Germany, diary entries written by men who could never fully understand her. These fragments, fragile as parchment, are the pieces that allow us to reconstruct her story. They remind us that she was not merely the hairy woman of exhibitions, but a person who lived, breathed, played music, travelled, married, and raised a child. Her endurance alone is remarkable. To survive half a century in a world that prized conformity, to travel from city to city across war-torn Europe, to live through famine, plague, and endless scrutiny, this required more than luck. It required resilience. Barbara's strength lay not in the way she looked, but in her ability to continue, to find a life where others might have found only shame. Her name now lingers in museum catalogues, in the margins of books, and in the archives of London, Paris, and Augsburg. Each record is like a faint footprint in dust-proof that she once stood, where no one else dared to stand. Proof that she existed not as a fable, but as flesh and thought and courage. And so, when the story of Barbara van Beck ends in 1668, it does not end in tragedy. It ends, rather, in a quiet kind of triumph. That a woman born with a rare and isolating condition could rise from obscurity, travel across the continent, and live on in memory long after her voice fell silent. She disappeared, yes, but she left behind a shape in history, a soft outline against the centuries. And if we listen carefully, beneath the pages of old diaries and the fading ink of 17th century pens, we can almost hear her still. Not the sound of applause or whispers, but a single breath of relief, a life, finally her own. For centuries after her death, one question has lingered like a quiet echo through the pages of history. Did Barbara van Beck truly control her own life, or was she merely used by those around her? It is a question without a simple answer, suspended somewhere between admiration and sorrow. In her childhood, there could be no doubt Barbara had no choice at all. She was led by her parents from city to city, displayed before paying audiences long before she could understand what it meant. The money that fell into their hands was earned by her body, by the uniqueness that marked her as different. She was a child turned into spectacle, an unwilling performer in a world that saw her not as a girl but as a curiosity. Yet adulthood brought change. The evidence that survives fragments of diaries, letters, and portraits suggests that by the time Barbara married Johann Michael van Beck in the year 1657, she had gained a measure of independence that few women of her era possessed. There is no record to prove she was forced to continue performing, and no hint of coercion in the writings of those who met her. Instead, what emerges is the portrait of a woman who had learned to navigate her world with quiet skill, turning her difference into livelihood, her strangeness into survival. In the 17th century, Women rarely had professions of their own. Most were confined to domestic life, dependent on fathers, brothers, or husbands for financial stability. To travel unchaperoned across Europe to London, Paris, Copenhagen, Rome, Milan, and back again was almost unthinkable for a woman of modest birth. Yet Barbara did just that, not once but repeatedly, for more than 3 decades. She spoke multiple languages, knew how to play the harpsichord, and carried herself with poise even in the presence of nobles and scholars. To some, she may have seemed a curiosity, but to others, she was a professional, someone who had transformed the spectacle of her condition into a career. That transformation was no small feat. It required intelligence, restraint, and a deep understanding of what the world expected from her. Barbara did not have the luxury of anonymity. She could not blend into a crowd or hide her appearance. What she could do was claim it, own it, and in doing so, control how others saw her. The woman once paraded by her parents had become, in time, the architect of her own survival. To the modern mind, her exhibitions might seem degrading, a cruel form of entertainment. But in the world of the 1600s, the boundaries between performance, science, and spectacle were blurred. Exhibitions of the unusual were also opportunities for income, mobility, and even education. For Barbara, who had few other options, it may have been the only path to self-sufficiency. Rather than being simply exploited, she may have turned the gaze of others into her own form of agency, a way to travel, to provide for her child, and to live with a degree of autonomy denied to most women of her time. Even so, one cannot ignore the possibility of exploitation. Her husband, Johann, was described by later writers as her manager, the one who arranged her shows and handled the proceeds. Whether he acted out of love or self-interest, history cannot tell us. Some, like James Granger, accused him of marrying Barbara purely for profit, though such claims were made more than a century after her death and lacked evidence. What remains clear is that, whatever his motives, Barbara was not entirely powerless. She was a partner, a performer, and, above all, a survivor. It is worth remembering that, despite her fame, Barbara lived in an age when even noble women had little control over their lives. Her ability to earn her own living, however unconventional the means was in itself extraordinary. She did what so few could. She provided for herself and her family, not through marriage or inheritance, but through her own resilience and intellect. In this sense, Barbara van Beck's story becomes something more than tragedy. It becomes a testament to the strength of a woman who refused to vanish beneath the weight of her circumstances. While others might have hidden away, ashamed or afraid, she stepped forward into the light again and again, allowing herself to be seen not as a victim, but as a person who understood that visibility, even when uncomfortable, could be power. To ask whether Barbara was exploited or independent is, perhaps, to misunderstand the complexity of her life. She lived in the narrow space between those two truths used by some, admired by others, but always adapting, always surviving. The boundaries of her freedom were set by her time, but within them, she carved out a small yet undeniable form of control. And so, more than 350 years later, when her name is spoken, it carries not the sound of pity, but of endurance. For in a world that sought to define her by her appearance, Barbara van Beck defined herself by her perseverance, and in that quiet defiance lies the truest form of freedom she could have ever known. It is believed that throughout her years of travel, Barbara van Beck met numerous scholars, artists, and writers, men of curiosity who sought not to mock her, but to understand the strangeness that surrounded her life. In an age fascinated by the boundaries of nature and the divine, Barbara was not regarded as a monster, but rather as what her contemporaries called a natural wonder. The phrase held a specific meaning in the 17th century. It described something extraordinary that inspired both awe and study. Painters, diarists, and philosophers saw in her not a spectacle of horror, but a living mystery of creation, proof of nature's infinite variety. Her portraits, scattered now in collections across Europe, show this perspective clearly. In them, Barbara stands calm and composed, her head slightly tilted, her gaze steady. The soft brown hair that covered her face was not exaggerated, not made grotesque. It was rendered with the same gentle attention given to any noblewoman's curls. Her clothing, velvet, lace, and pearls, was carefully depicted, and her posture was graceful, almost regal. There is no cruelty in these images, no hint that she was meant to frighten or amuse. Instead, she appears dignified, aware of her own presence, and fully human. This portrayal sets her apart from the later treatment of people with differences. By the 19th century, under the gaze of the Victorian public, such individuals were often cast into the grim world of freak shows, travelling exhibitions, where the unusual became a source of mockery and exploitation. But Barbara lived in a different time, when the line between curiosity and cruelty had not yet hardened. Her audiences may have stared, but many did so with a measure of respect, viewing her as a marvel of nature rather than an abomination. Centuries later, her image would resurface in the modern world. In the year 2017, the Wellcome Collection in London acquired a portrait of Barbara van Beck. The painting, believed to date from the middle of the 17th century, shows her dressed in fine European fashion, her features softened by the artist's hand. When the museum's research development manager was interviewed by the Guardian newspaper, she explained, "She is not portrayed as a freak as the Victorians would have described her, but as a woman with great self-possession and presence." That observation captures something essential about Barbara's legacy. Though her life was marked by hardship, exploitation, and curiosity, what remains of her in art and writing is not ugliness, but strength. The brushstrokes of her portraits and the measured words of Evelyn's diary suggest that she carried herself with confidence and intelligence, commanding attention not through shock, but through composure. Even in a world eager to define her by her difference, Barbara defined herself by her dignity. Over time, she became a figure both historical and symbolic, an embodiment of what it meant to live visibly in a world that demanded conformity. The fact that her portrait survived at all is proof of how deeply she impressed those who met her. Painters did not preserve the faces of sideshow attractions. They preserved those who made them think, who stirred their imaginations. Barbara, the woman once called the hairy lady, became, in the eyes of her contemporaries, something more profound, a reminder of the limits of judgment and the vastness of creation. We will never know where she died, nor when. No burial record has yet been found, no inscription carved with her name. Perhaps she lies somewhere in Germany, or Holland, or England, her grave unmarked, her story folded into the soil. Yet in a sense, Barbara van Beck never truly disappeared. Her likeness, her legend, and her quiet defiance continue to live through the centuries. In the dim light of a gallery, where her portrait now hangs, the centuries between us seem to fade. Her eyes, painted nearly 400 years ago, still look out with calm composure. The hair that once provoked whispers now seems almost luminous under the glass. Time has done what compassion could not in her lifetime. It has softened the gaze. Barbara's story remains unfinished, not because it lacks an ending, but because it continues to ask something of us. She challenges the way we see, the way we define beauty, and the way we treat those who are different. Her life, once consumed by spectacle, now stands as a quiet act of resistance, a testament to how one woman, born into a world of prejudice and fear, turned her difference into endurance. We may never find her resting place, but her legacy endures in every word, every sketch, every brushstroke that refused to reduce her to ridicule. She lived as both marvel and mystery, but most of all, she lived as herself. And in that simple, steadfast truth lies the power that makes her unforgettable, a woman who faced her fate and transformed it, not with noise or rebellion, but with grace. Barbara van Beck did not merely exist. She lived fiercely in an age when difference was nearly synonymous with exile. The 17th century was a world ruled by faith and fear, where the boundaries between divine wonder and demonic curse were perilously thin. In that fragile balance of superstition and science, a woman whose face was covered in hair could easily have been condemned as something unholy, a creature touched by witchcraft or marked by sin. Yet Barbara did not hide. She stood before the gaze that sought to diminish her, and in doing so, she turned it into her strength. When others might have sought shadows, she chose light. When others would have fled from stares, she faced them, calm and unyielding. Her life was not a tale of surrender, but of resilience, of a woman who learned how to transform the world's cruel curiosity into her own form of survival. Across Europe's old cities, London, Paris, Rome, Milan, Frankfurt, Augsburg, she walked beneath the same skies as kings and philosophers, yet her journey was lonelier than most. People came to see her as they might visit a marvel, a living oddity to speak of in letters and diaries. But when they left, what lingered was not disgust or mockery, it was wonder, tinged with respect. Her presence forced them to confront the boundaries of their own understanding. Barbara was never merely a victim of illness. She was, instead, the living embodiment of courage. The courage to exist, to stand within her own skin even when the world called it unnatural. Every hair upon her face was a defiance of the narrow rules that governed beauty and belonging. And in that defiance, she revealed a truth that still whispers through time, that dignity cannot be erased by difference. In the candlelit halls and crowded squares where she appeared, Barbara was more than the sum of her condition. She was composed, articulate, and intelligent qualities that confounded the assumptions of those who came expecting to see something monstrous. She performed, she conversed, she played music. In her calm voice and deliberate movements, she reminded her audience that what they saw was only skin deep. Beneath the hair that drew their eyes was a woman of depth and will, no less human, no less capable of grace. The 17th century was not kind to those who deviated from the ordinary. Across Europe, the witch trials still burned through villages and towns. Superstition and fear of the unknown dictated who was accepted and who was cast out. A woman marked by nature as Barbara was, could have easily been accused of sorcery or possession. Yet there are no records of persecution, no accusations of witchcraft, no violent rejection. That in itself is remarkable. It suggests that Barbara's poise and intelligence disarmed suspicion that she was able, somehow, to command enough respect to be seen not as cursed, but as extraordinary. Perhaps the very traits that set her apart also protected her. The people who met her, men like John Evelyn and Samuel Pepys, did not describe her as terrifying. They described her as well-shaped, mannerly, musical. Even when they stared, they saw her humanity. And so Barbara van Beck became something rare, a woman who lived publicly with her difference, not hidden in shame, but standing firmly within her own reality. In the quiet corners of those ancient cities, she must have known solitude more deeply than most. To be admired and pitied at once is a lonely fate. To live beneath the eyes of the world yet remain unseen for who you truly are, that is its own kind of exile. But Barbara bore it with the composure of one who understood that she could not change what she was, only how she lived with it. The image that survives of her head lifted, gaze steady, expression serene tells us more than words ever could. It speaks of pride, of endurance, of the quiet strength it takes to exist when existence itself is a challenge. She was a flame in the wind, steady, even as the air around her tried to extinguish it. In the dim streets of 17th century Europe, her shadow must have moved like a question. Soft, persistent, unanswerable. Was she a marvel? A mystery? Or simply a woman who refused to disappear? The world around her may have been cold with judgment, but Barbara van Beck remained her own small source of light. And as the centuries pass, that light still flickers in memory, a reminder of how courage can exist not in great acts of defiance, but in the quiet act of standing before the world, unhidden, and saying without words, "This is who I am." No one knows for certain where Barbara van Beck died, nor in what year her long and extraordinary life came to its end. The records stop without warning, as if a page of history were quietly torn away. It is possible that she passed in peace, perhaps in a small house somewhere in Germany or Holland, far from the noise of cities and the eyes of those who once paid to see her. There, in that imagined stillness, she might at last have lived as herself without the need to perform, without the whisper of curiosity following her name. Or perhaps her death came on the road, during one final journey, another exhibition that carried her across borders and through candlelit halls. The truth is lost, absorbed into time's vast silence. What remains certain is that she left this world quietly, as she had lived gently, persistently, and with a kind of wisdom that only comes from enduring. For Barbara must have known that fame, like firelight, burns bright but never lasts. The same audiences that once applauded her would move on to the next spectacle. The same painters who captured her face would turn to other subjects. Yet unlike them, Barbara's story did not fade. It lingered in diaries, portraits, and second-hand accounts, carried through centuries as a faint but steady echo. Her end, unrecorded though it was, seems fitting for a woman who lived so much of her life in half-shadow known, yet not truly known, seen, yet rarely understood. To vanish without ceremony, without inscription or fanfare, was perhaps her final act of peace. After decades of being watched, of being studied, of being both admired and pitied, she disappeared into the one place where no one could follow, the quiet. Still, the silence did not erase her. The writings of John Evelyn, John Bullfinch, and Samuel Pepys preserved fragments of her existence, while her portraits ensured that her face, gentle, patient, and serene beneath its veil of hair, would outlast the centuries. In those fragments, the outline of her life endures, like a candle's glow reflected faintly in glass. Barbara Van Beck became more than a woman of her time. She became a symbol of a truth that the world is slow to accept, that courage can take many forms, and sometimes the bravest act is simply to live as oneself. She was born into an age when difference invited fear, yet she refused to let that fear define her. Each city she entered, each stage she stood upon, each conversation she held was a small victory over the cruelty of convention. And though the exact moment of her death remains unknown, her afterlife in memory is unmistakable. The diaries that mention her were written by men who recorded everything from royal intrigues to weather changes, yet they took care to note her presence. That care alone suggests the impression she left behind. Even centuries later, her image continues to stir both curiosity and compassion. It is comforting to imagine her final days, not as a spectacle, but as stillness. Perhaps she sat by a window in the late afternoon, listening to the sound of the wind, her hands resting quietly in her lap. Perhaps she watched the snow fall and thought of her childhood in Augsburg, the city of her birth, where it all began on the 18th of February, 1629. The light would have softened around her, and for the first time in her life, no one would have been watching. And when at last her breath slowed, she would have understood what many never do, that the applause of others is brief, but the peace of acceptance endures. The world she left behind moved on, yet her image did not vanish. Her story became part of a larger one, a story about how humanity views those who are different, and how those who are different teach humanity to see anew. When people speak of Barbara Van Beck today, it is no longer with fear or derision. They speak of her as a woman of courage and composure, a figure who faced the harshness of fate without bitterness. Centuries separate us from her now, yet her spirit lingers wherever people seek meaning in what sets them apart. She remains an emblem of quiet defiance, proof that dignity can flourish even under the cruelest gaze. And though her resting place may never be found, her memory lives woven through words, brushstrokes, and the enduring thought that being different need not mean being less. Barbara Van Beck left the world as she lived in it, softly, bravely, and with a grace that outlasted the noise. And in that silence, she found what she had been denied all her life, the freedom simply to be. Centuries have passed since Barbara Van Beck last stood beneath the gaze of a curious crowd, and yet her story continues to breathe softly, steadily, like a lesson whispered through time. The world has changed, but not as much as we might wish. People still struggle to see beyond the surface, still measure worth by appearance, wealth, or conformity. But slowly, through stories like hers, we are learning that what gives a person value is not how they look, but how they face the life they are given. Barbara lived in a century ruled by rigid hierarchies and unbending expectations. The 17th century was an age of portraits and propriety, of measured beauty and silent obedience, especially for women. Those who fit its image were celebrated. Those who did not were forgotten or hidden away. Yet Barbara refused both paths. She did not hide her difference, nor did she let it consume her. Instead, she transformed it into her means of survival, a way to earn a living, to travel, to exist on her own terms, in a world that offered her almost no place. Her body, covered in soft brown hair, could have been her ruin. Instead, she made it her signature. She turned pain into profession, and the staring eyes of strangers into her audience. To some, it may seem tragic. To others, it is extraordinary. But whichever way one sees it, Barbara Van Beck lived, and that in itself was defiance. In a world that equated worth with beauty, Barbara taught another kind of beauty, the beauty of endurance. She stood before those who came to marvel or to mock, and she never let them see her broken. Her condition might have set her apart, but her composure, her intelligence, and her grace made her unforgettable. When John Evelyn wrote of her, he did not describe a freak or a monster, he described a woman who played music beautifully, who spoke with elegance, who carried herself with dignity. Even Samuel Pepys, whose curiosity bordered on spectacle, could not deny the fascination of her presence. She was, to all who met her, something far more than her appearance suggested, and that is why her name, unlike so many others, endured. She became one of the very few women of the 17th century, whose story entered history not through birthright or scandal, but through courage. She had no throne, no title, no protector. What she had was the strength to live in full view of the world and refuse shame. Today, her story feels strangely modern. We live in a time where difference still divides, where the shapes of our bodies, the shades of our skin, or the identities of our hearts can still invite cruelty. People still struggle beneath the weight of judgment, of expectation, of the fear of being seen, and yet, Barbara's life stands as a quiet reminder. You can be different and still be deserving of love, of respect, of peace. Her lesson is not loud or triumphant. It is tender, like a candle burning low but steady. It tells us that wounds, when met with compassion, can become a kind of beauty. The scars we carry, visible or hidden, can be the proof not of what broke us, but of what we survived. Barbara's difference, once a source of shame and spectacle, became the very thing that allowed her story to outlast those who pitied her. If we close our eyes, we can still imagine her walking through the narrow streets of some old European city, Augsburg perhaps, or London. Her figure small but certain, her steps quiet but sure. The air would have been cold, the cobblestones slick with rain, the chatter of onlookers trailing behind her. And in that sound, in those whispers, lived the same questions that echo now. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to belong? Barbara's life answers softly. To be human is not to be perfect, and to belong is not to look the same. Her courage was not the courage of battle or fame, but the courage of being seen and still standing. When we think of her now, we do not see a hairy woman. We see a survivor of a merciless age. We see a human being who lived truthfully in a world that rewarded masks. We see a woman who turned her difference into endurance, and her endurance into legacy. And so, Barbara van Beck continues to speak, even across the stretch of 4 centuries, not with grandeur or bitterness, but with quiet conviction. Her story reminds us that every human life, no matter how strange or scarred, carries its own light. And when we choose to see with kindness instead of judgment, that light like hers does not fade. If Barbara van Beck left anything behind for us to learn, it is perhaps the quietest and most difficult of lessons, the lesson of acceptance. Acceptance of oneself, and acceptance of the imperfect world in which we must all live. Her life, measured in centuries past yet still whispering through time, teaches that while we may not be given the power to choose our form, we are always given the power to choose our way of living. Barbara did not choose her face, her body, or the endless stairs that followed her from childhood, but she chose how to walk beneath those stairs. She chose, again and again, to lift her head. Between the cruel laughter of the ignorant and the uneasy fascination of the curious, she found a kind of stillness, an unspoken courage that could not be taken from her. Her life was not one of defiance shouted to the world, but of quiet endurance, of dignity that refused to crumble. In an age defined by appearances, she dared to exist without apology. In a century that offered women little more than silence, she found a way to speak through her presence. And that perhaps is why her name survives when so many others have vanished. Her strength was not the strength of rebellion, but the strength of acceptance. The ability to live wholly within herself, to acknowledge what could not be changed, and still move forward with grace. There is a kind of freedom that hides inside acceptance, one that many never find even in this modern age. For freedom is not the absence of constraint, it is the quiet understanding of who we are within it. Barbara lived in a world that sought to confine her to the boundaries of her body, her gender, her difference. Yet within those boundaries, she carved out a life that was unmistakably her own. She performed, she conversed, she travelled across the breadth of 17th century Europe, and she did so with her dignity intact. Her choice to live openly was itself an act of liberation. To step into public view, knowing what the world would see, required a courage that transcended the cruelty of her age. Many would have hidden, covered their face, or withdrawn from sight. But Barbara chose the opposite. She chose to exist in the full light of others' eyes. In doing so, she transformed the very thing meant to shame her into a source of power. Each city she visited, London, Paris, Rome, Frankfurt, Augsburg, became not just a stage for her exhibitions but a testament to her resilience. Every journey was a declaration that she would not be erased, that she would not surrender her place in the world to fear or humiliation. To live so visibly, and yet so quietly proud, was an act of strength that few of her contemporaries could match. In her acceptance of herself, Barbara also held a mirror to the society that surrounded her. Her existence forced people to confront their own discomforts, to question the boundaries between beauty and deformity, humanity and wonder. The people who came to see her, scholars, nobles, writers and commoners, may have believed they were witnessing a curiosity of nature. Yet perhaps, without realizing it, they were witnessing something greater, a living example of what it means to inhabit one's truth. For all its superstition and cruelty, her time could not take from her what was most essential, the quiet knowledge of her own worth. Barbara understood something that many, even now, struggle to grasp. That shame is not born from difference, but from the refusal to see the dignity within it. She taught, simply by living, that acceptance is not surrender, it is strength. When she walked into a room, the world saw her condition first. But when she spoke, when she played her harpsichord, when she met their eyes without flinching, they saw something else entirely. A woman who had made peace with herself. And that peace became her form of freedom. Even now, centuries later, we find ourselves returning to her example. In a world obsessed with perfection, where image and approval weigh more heavily than truth, Barbara's life feels like a kind of still water, a reflection reminding us of what it means to simply be. She showed that freedom does not require us to escape the gaze of others, only to understand who we are when that gaze falls upon us. Her lesson endures, that self-acceptance is not a quiet resignation but a profound act of courage. It is to say, I am as I am, and to mean it not as defiance, but as peace. Barbara van Beck, born in a time of superstition and judgment, discovered that peace within herself long before the world was ready to give it to her. And perhaps that is why, even now, when her name is spoken softly in history's dim corridors, it carries with it a calm strength, a reminder that true freedom is not found in the absence of imperfection, but in the grace of accepting it.